The joy of freedom is, the way Milton Friedman put it in his blurb was, it's a quasi-autobiographical making of the case for freedom, and I think that's accurate. When I've talked to people over the years, what I've learned is people come to their belief in freedom in lots of different ways. It's a particular experience they had that they paid attention to and learned from, and so on. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat? Well, in fact, it does relate to Milton Friedman. Milton and Rose Friedman had a book called Free to Choose, a Personal Statement. And I've read the book a couple of times. There's not much personal in there. And I thought, what would be a personal statement? Well, my book. And so it's kind of how I came to believe in freedom, how I see the power of freedom in solving people's problems, my stories that influence me from not famous people and famous people that make the case for freedom. So that was the idea. Well, I want to precede that by saying who's the person I've learned the most from. And I think that was Ayn Rand. I don't buy her whole system, but I learned in this basic way that she made me think about things I would have never thought about. And I think that on many of the issues, she's basically got it right. And I was not a big reader before reading Ayn Rand. And I think I went from reading maybe 4 books a year, mainly novels, to reading almost a book a week for a few years in economics, history, political science, occasionally philosophy, although I found those harder. So I think that set the framework for everything else. And then within economics, I would say Milton Friedman. I remember when I read Capitalism and Freedom, I was about 17, 18, and it just was exciting. Well, actually, I found it by reading his Newsweek column. I even remember the column. It was titled "The Public Be Damned." And I thought, ooh, this reminds me of a little scene in Atlas Shrugged. And it wasn't that at all, but it was still very good. It was basically saying, people say that businessmen have the view the public be damned, but the real entity that has the view the public be damned is the government. And he talked about the post office and how they don't care about customers and so on. And I went, who is this guy who gets to be in Newsweek? And then I discovered Capitalism and Freedom. And these were the days when copying, we called it Xeroxing in those days, cost 25 cents a page. So I was very selective about which pages I copied. And then I realized, you know what, this is crazy. Spend the $6.95 and order the book. And so that was a huge book. I remember a chapter on occupational licensing and saying, look, if I'm going to make the case against government requiring licenses to be in a profession, I don't want to take the easiest case. I want to take the hardest case. And the hardest case is doctors. And he laid it out beautifully. I remember following my mother around our little apartment, reading it not to her but at her. I mean, she had no interest, but I was so excited about this segment of that chapter. So I'd say that one. When I got to UCLA, absolutely the one there who influenced me the most was Armin Elchin. He had written this textbook with a guy named William Allen that's just like no other textbook. It's just profound, subtle. There's no way you can use it for a typical undergraduate class, I learned. It's just too far beyond. And in fact, I prepared it when I was a TA for an undergraduate class. I prepared for every question they could have asked me from the back of each chapter, which they never did. But in preparing it, I learned so much economics, and it helped me with my qualifying exams in the PhD program. And the man just thought so clearly. It was one of the first real indicators in economics to me that you could both be completely rigorous and use words. You can be rigorous without a single equation. And Armin Elchin, I think, demonstrated that more than almost anyone else. So I would say that person. And then I guess I would have to reach back and say Henry Hazlitt, because he was one of the first people I read. His book, Economics in One Lesson, it was recommended by Ayn Rand in one of her newsletters. And it was just this clear thinking. And again, it's not as if I'd been thinking about these issues. I was 17 or 18. But he got me thinking about these issues. It's like, wow, you know, I've kind of heard this argument that if you take longer to do something, you create more jobs, and that kind of made sense to me, but it never totally made sense to me. There was something in my brain saying that doesn't totally make sense, and Henry Hazlitt laid out clearly why it doesn't make sense, and he was drawing on Frederick Bastiat before him, and so those kinds of things that just drove it home. So I would say those three thinkers. I'd have to say Karl Marx. I mean, Karl Marx's labor theory of value is wrong. The value of something doesn't derive from the labor put into it. It derives from people's subjective preferences. Once you say the labor theory of value is wrong, there's not that much left of his system. Also, there was his idea of diminishing investment opportunities, which has turned out not to be true. I mean, just innovation after innovation happens, and it creates huge investment opportunities. So I would say I disagree with him more than almost anyone else in economics, more than anyone else I can think of in economics. I would say John Maynard Keynes, in the sense that I think he really set economics back. I think he set it back more than Marx did, because people came along pretty quickly and refuted Marx. People like Eugene von Boerbock, the Austrian economist. But people didn't come along to refute Keynes to nearly the same extent. And I thought Keynesianism was almost dead. And this latest recession and the so-called stimulus bill and so on, and the arguments that various economists have made for it, make me realize that it is not dead. So as far as economists who have influenced the profession, and I think Marx really hasn't ultimately, I would have to say John Maynard Keynes. I think it began with Ayn Rand, really. I had read The Fountainhead in my first year of college at the University of Winnipeg in Canada, and it just blew me away. It was just so shocking to me what she was saying in that book, and then I read the Atlas Shrugged and got more into the political ideas, and then started reading some of the nonfiction she wrote, and then started reading some of the nonfiction she recommended, things like Henry Hazlitt, Economics in One Lesson, and Ludwig von Mises, and so on. And I just found myself drawn to the economics. And I started arguing with my professors. I was a math major, so I was arguing with one of these math professors. And what I noticed in our discussions, and in my arguments with people generally, is that even if you started from a principle, the government shouldn't do X or whatever because people have rights, it very quickly got to the issue of practicality within one or two rounds of the argument. And when you get into issues of, of practicality, you get into the issues often of economics. And so here I was advocating something that seemed right, but I didn't know how practical it was. And this math professor I argued with said, well, I admit you beat me in this particular argument, but I'm a math professor. If your arguments are so good, why don't you go over to the economics department and see what they have to say about it? I certainly think a free society needs a political theory, and I'll say a little about that, and an economic theory in a different way. We need a political theory because we need to have a view of the proper role of the proper relationship between people and each other, and between people and the government if there's to be a government. And you can't really have an idea of people's rights without having that theory, that political theory. I think it needs an economic theory in a different sense, a narrower sense, and that is the economic theory should be a spin-off of the political theory. In other words, if people have rights, what does this imply for the economy? Well, it implies that people should be free to buy and sell what they want as long as it isn't, as long as they're not buying and selling slaves. It means people should be able to price at what they want to price things at. People should be able to work in any occupation they want as long as it's not being a hitman or something like that. And so, yes, an economic theory in that narrow sense. Economic theory to economists means something completely different. An economic theory to economists means a theory about how the economy actually works. And I think you need some basic understanding of how an economy works in order to be able to understand why you don't need a big role for government. But I don't think you need to pick a particular economic theory. So, for example, there's a large debate among economists who are strong believers in the free market between so-called Austrian economists and so-called Chicago economists. And a lot of people have called me a Chicago economist. We used to joke that I went to UCLA for my PhD. I went to the University of Chicago at Los Angeles. But I don't think you need to resolve those issues in order to have the economic theory you need to justify, defend, and promote a free society. And so I'm a big tent person in that sense, that there are things in Austrian economics I agree with, things I don't, but we can be just as avid promoters and believers in freedom no matter what our view is, say, on the business cycle. In 1978, I would say that was the peak of the mainstream's acceptance of free markets, libertarianism, the critique of government. And I think it was because government was doing so badly. We had inflation in the double digits that was threatening. We didn't know where it was going to go. And I ran into mainstream economists. I was in my late 20s. I ran into mainstream economists in their 40s who were pretty worried. You know, can we even stick at 12% inflation? Will it go to 20? That kind of thing. We had inflation putting us in higher tax brackets, so the government getting a bigger and bigger share of our income. We had the Nixon-Ford-Carter energy mess, the price controls and all the regulation that it led to as a response to the shortages. So the price controls caused shortages. Then instead of saying let's get rid of the price controls, they say let's dictate fuel economy in cars and in houses and buildings and so on. So we had that whole mess. And there was a critique of regulation, there was a critique of high taxation, and a critique of inflation. And they all kind of came together in the late 70s. And I think that the views of free market people were most accepted then. So that's bad news in a sense, because look where we've come now. But here's what I think has happened. That we did get rid of some of the worst excesses. So inflation was brought down to low single digits. We got the tax system under control, so it wasn't taking a bigger and bigger chunk of our income. We got indexing under the Reagan tax cut. We deregulated, and actually Carter deserves credit for this. They deregulated a number of industries, airlines, trucking, railroads, and all those worked well. In the 80s, Reagan deregulated natural gas. That's worked well. The price controls on oil were removed late in the Carter administration, and the final step was taken in the first 2 weeks. Reagan used his discretionary power to end the controls altogether. So a lot of those things turned around and the economy improved. So as a result, I think a lot of academic economists lost their interest. I see a mixed story, in other words, about the acceptance of libertarian or classical liberal views. I do think, though, that one of the signs that we're getting to them is the ad hominems, you know, the attacks on character instead of attacks on the arguments. Because, you know, the old line that lawyers use, if the facts are against you, use the law. If the law is against you, use the facts. If both the law and the facts are against you, pound the table and shout. Well, it's the same in economics. If you don't have really good arguments, attack the character of the person making the arguments. And that's, in a way, a sure sign that we are getting somewhere with the arguments.